Okay, the next component that I'm going to solder in are these input and output jacks. And in my example here, you can see I actually already have the capacitors in, but I'm going to replace the order of the video so that neither the blue nor these two red capacitors are in there, because I like to do these first. The reason being is you can, when they're the highest component on the board, if you do them right after the rail splitter chip, the TLE2426, you can just put them in and lean them over. But right now, you can see that that capacitor is higher, so it only hits on the front. So to make up for that, if you do make this mistake, I'm just going to set it on some scrap pieces of something that won't be harmed if they get a little hot. In this case, I just have some scrap pieces of laser cut acrylic I'm just going to rest it on. And then soldering them is pretty much like soldering everything else. I usually like to get one pin in, make sure it's lined up correctly, and then do the rest. You'll notice when you solder that this pin here and this pin here is going to take a lot more heat, and that's because it's hooked up to the ground plane, which is going to sink heat better. So I'm going to solder both of those, and then I'm going to check that those are seated all the way before I get the rest. Yeah, because they're not. They're up a little bit, so I'm going to heat that up, push it in, and now it's not really going to go anywhere. Another thing to note is when you do these audio jacks, you want to check beforehand that you're not, these little pins are pretty delicate, and if one's slightly bent from shipping or something and you just push it in there, it can mash it pretty bad, so you want to make sure it lines up before you push it through. And sometimes I like to go through and just reheat all those, make sure we don't have any cold solder joints. So you can see now we have audio jacks, and all we have left is the volume knob and then the battery cable. Alright, the next component I usually solder is the LED. And I got a nice low power one, so it won't drain your battery, but it'll at least show you when it's on. You can see the LED has two different lengths of leads, and that's common with LEDs, and that shows you because it's a directional component. So you can see this shorter one here, and you can see on D1 on the actual circuit board there is kind of a D shape where one pin has a square and a flat side over here, and then a round side over here. The short pin is going to go on this flat side with the square, and if you don't put it the correct way, it will not work. So you have to make sure you get it lined up correctly, and then I'll just set it over like that and solder it. A little better angle there. And for this, I'll go back to the larger solder. And generally what I like to do is after I get the first pin soldered, I like to double check that it's down all the way and just kind of give it a little push while I do the other one. You can see that's in correctly. So now I'm just going to clip the leads. And then we have an LED soldered in. Okay, so now the next component I like to solder is the electrolytic capacitor, which is the big blue one here. And it is also a directional component. You can see it has a shorter lead, that is the negative lead, and it is actually labeled, which you can see this big minus sign here, and that corresponds to the shorter lead. When you look on the actual pattern for C3, you can see it has a plus sign on the right side, so make sure that the negative does not go into that one, that the positive side, which is the longer lead, will go into the plus side. And it fits in there pretty well, and you just kind of push it in. And I usually just flip over the board and solder it up. Same way we've soldered everything else. Alright. Looks like that's in there. So I'm going to clip those extra leads, and then we can solder the two film capacitors. One thing to note, when you're clipping these leads, you want to clip them pretty close to the board. If you clip them too high, they cause a potential to short on the bottom of the actual tin. So you want to clip them all as close as you can. In particular, the battery leads need to be very close. Alright, so the next component we're going to solder in are these two signal capacitors, and you can see there's no markings to signify directionality because they don't have any. They are film capacitors, and these are what the audio signal actually goes through. The other capacitors for the power circuitry. And what I like to do when I put these in is you can put them in either direction, obviously, because there's no directionality, and they go in where C2 and C5 are. There is a plus marking, but you can ignore that. I just put that there in case someone wanted to use a different type of capacitor and they needed polarity, but I can't think of a situation where you'd want to do that. So when I put these in, I will just feed them through. I usually push them down about roughly that far, and then I will, from the back side, I'll kind of hold it straight and then just fold it out a little bit, and that holds it in place pretty nicely. And then I'll do the same thing with the other one. And then the soldering procedure is basically the same as everything else so far. And then of course, clip the excess like we do with everything else. And I like to clip them pretty close. Let me zoom in, let me get that focused. You can see I don't leave a lot of leads on the back. You can see we're getting really close to being done. The last two components I'm going to solder up are the potentiometer or volume knob, which is a built-in switch, and then the battery connector. And I like to do it where I'd like to do the volume knob first. It's really pretty easy to do because it just kind of snaps into these holes here. I mean, it just kind of holds itself in place, so it's pretty easy. You want to definitely make sure you get the audio signal runs through here, so you want to make sure every pin gets a good solder connection, especially these 6 on this side. The back 2 are a switch. So I usually like to go through and just kind of retouch them all, make sure they all got enough heat to flow out properly. Oh, and you see I got those 2 bridged. So what I'm going to do is clean my tip here and make sure that that doesn't go over to the other. Alright, so that's on there good, and now I'm going to put in the battery. The battery connector. And for that, you can see we have a red and a black. And the red wire is going to go towards the plus. The black wire is going to go towards the minus. If you mess that up, the entire thing will not work. So you got to make sure you get the red into the plus. I'm going to solder that up. Alright, now a very important step to this part is that you can see those leads from that wire stick up quite a bit. Since we're using double stick foam tape to push this down into the tin, that could cause a short on the tin. So you want to clip that very close to the board, because we don't want any chance of that. So you can see I clipped that nice and close to there. We don't want any chance of that shorting out on the board. And now we have pretty much a fully assembled headphone amplifier. You can see our op amp IC is not there right now. However, everything else is in place. Alright, the next step before we place the op amp is we want to make sure that everything else is done correctly, and if it is, it'll be splitting the power supply evenly. And in order to do that, first we need to get a multimeter on volts mode. We need a 9-volt battery, so we're going to check this 9-volt battery and see what it reads here. Alright, looks like this one's kind of low. It's at 6.99 volts, but that's fine. We can still check it. Alright, so I have that hooked in. It's hard to see because of this video light, but the LED is turning on when I turn it on and off. You really can't see in the video light. So I'm going to turn it on, and then we're going to check. So take note of the direction I have this at, and which probe I put where. So let me get this on. So when I place the black in the upper left and the red there, I get negative 3.47, and then when I place it in this one, I get 3.47, and that's what it should be. It should be splitting the power supply into a negative and a positive component. And that, so you just want to reiterate, this here should read negative half of your battery voltage, and this should read positive half of your battery voltage within a few hundredths. It doesn't have to be the exact number. Your multimeter is probably not accurate enough to do that anyway, but it should be close. If it's off, it'll be off by quite a bit. So now we can place our op amp. It's important when placing an op amp to get the correct alignment. Now you remember when we placed our op amp socket, there's a little indentation here. And you can see on the actual op amp itself that there's another indentation. You must align it correctly. If not, the op amp will get very hot and probably be damaged. When you place the op amp in the socket, you'll notice that these pins are very thin, so you have to be extremely careful with them. And you need to, they kind of need a little bit of a squeeze inward. Let me focus it. So you'll place them in, and you do not want to push down until every single one is in, lined up correctly. You can see those are all in, those are all in, and you can push it down and it's good. And the benefit of these sockets is that you can actually use different op amps if you would like. So now we have a completed amp circuit board. At this point, I think it's a good idea to hook up something to it, test it, make sure it's working right audio wise. So I like to, get an MP3 player, hook it into the input, hook up my headphones to the output, turn it on, listen to music for a little while. Alright, this last step is just going to be mounting the amplifier in the tin. So to do that, provide your class with a roll of 3M double stick tape, and we're going to use that to mount the board down inside this tin here, which I've pre-punched for you. And then we also have 2 pieces of neoprene foam that'll go in the back to hold the battery. First step I like to do is I want to make sure that we have no leads sticking up too high. I don't trim any of these IC pin ones, but that's probably the maximum height we want, that and the volume knob. So I don't trim any of the IC socket or the volume knob, but if you have any of the resistors or the battery sticking up higher, you should probably trim those a little lower. The next step is I like to double check the alignment and make sure. I have checked all these before I sent them off, but you want to make sure your volume or your jacks will get to where they will stick out of the tin and line up like that. Let me see if I can get a better focus. And that lines up great. I've pre-checked all these before I sent them off to you, so that should be fine. Then the next thing is just applying double stick tape to the bottom of your board. So you will just roll some out, and you don't want it to stick out beyond this front edge. So I usually put some on and I like to push it down. Then I'll take some scissors and be careful not to cut the battery wire. And then it's very important here that there's no metal pins sticking through the bottom of the tin, so you want to make sure you really get a tight seam between these 2 pieces here. And then get that pushed down. Now the reason we checked that the audio was working well before this is it is possible if you push down too hard in the tin or something, you can short out the amp. So that way we know it worked beforehand and we can just remount it. So now I got tape on there. I'm going to get it firmly on the bottom of this. I pre-washed all the tins out so they shouldn't have any dust that's going to cause bad adhesion. You want to make sure you get it lined up through the holes correctly before you push down, and then mount it in. As you can see, the jacks all stick out fine. You got your volume, which, by the way, this is a good time to put on the volume knob, which is provided. And it has kind of a little D shape inside of it, and that lines up with the D shape on here. And it just pushes on. The very last step is these 2 pieces of foam here, which hold the battery in place. And just place them along the side back here. Connect your battery. Make sure your cord's not in the way. And you have a complete amplifier now.